All right, today we are going to be looking at fallacies and arguments, or at least some of them for this one, and we'll look at more in the next video. So what does fallacy mean, right? What is it? And I guess I should go to that slide here so you can see. There's several things with it. One of the things, if you're looking at kind of the definition, common flawed style of argument that is used frequently enough to be given a name. So if we look at this here, just let me change the color. If we look at this here, right? Okay, a common flawed style of argument, and it's there's tons of those, right? But that is used frequently enough that we've given it a name. And there's a lot. There are a lot of fallacies. It isn't just one or two, right? So there are lots of flawed arguments, and these are ones that just keep coming up, are popular to use over and over again, that they finally have been, given a name at some time. They generally are failed arguments in terms of logic, like how we would define a valid, successful argument, but are not failures in persuading people. And that is the key here with these fallacies, the ones that have the names, the ones that we're going to be looking at. Why they're important to look at is because they're used all the time. They're used, if once you become aware of them, you hear them in speeches, you read them in articles, you hear them in regular conversations with friends, you see it on social media. These are, and the reason that they're used so frequently is because they're successful. They work at convincing people that the argument they're providing is a valid argument, and it persuades people. People fall for the use of fallacies in arguments because they play to a variety of fears, beliefs, emotions that we have. And because they're used so frequently, I think some of the time people start to see them as valid arguments because you hear it over and over again, right? Just the act of repetition creates some of that catalyst for that. So ultimately, right, on the surface, these seem plausible, and then the repetition of hearing them all the time, I think, even increases that further. But when reality, they are, they're not good arguments, and they're not valid. And the problem with this is that, if we're taken in by fallacious arguments, the issue then becomes that you're easily swayed by things that actually don't have any logical bearing or supportive fact. Some of them are more obvious than others, right? There's going to be some that are pretty subtle. And then there's the ones like ad hominem that are attacking people. And these should be pretty easy to notice, right? Appeal to popularity is another one that I think is pretty obvious with that. Sometimes the appeal, like I said, the ad hominem or appeal to person is obvious. But the issue is that the fact is people keep using them because they work, right? Obviously attacking people works. So how do we make sure that we can recognize them and be able to say, okay, wait a minute, I shouldn't be making a decision based on the information that was just made in this argument because it's not even a valid argument. And in fact, you're just using this tactic to psychologically convince someone that what you're saying is sound. Because it really is this kind of psychological, as it says, this psychologically persuasive argument that just doesn't have any actual sound facts behind it. There's two kind of types that we're looking at. For this one, we're going to be looking at irrelevant premises. And then on the next one, we'll be looking at unacceptable premises. So irrelevant premises are these have no bearing on the truth of the conclusion, right? An argument may seem to offer reasons for accepting the conclusion, but the reasons have nothing to do with the conclusion. So again, the premise, you remember in an argument, we have a premise and the conclusion. And irrelevant premises, the premise that's being given, may appear like it has a connection to the conclusion, but it doesn't. And it doesn't matter. That premise has no connection to the truth of the conclusion. Again, why fallacies work is because they often are tricky, and it sounds like it should be connected to the conclusion, right? And then unacceptable premises, which we'll look at in the next lecture, these are relevant to the conclusion, but are still dubious in nature. Like, the argument may have a premise that pertains to the conclusion, but it doesn't adequately do it enough to create a valid argument. And they often are dubious because they are intended to support the evidence that they provide is meant to support the conclusion, but it's too weak and or defective. So that's kind of the difference, is the irrelevant ones premises have no connection to the outcome of the conclusion. Unacceptable premises do have some connection to, but are still unacceptable in terms of logic for being valid and sound arguments. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at here is a genetic fallacy. And this refers to non-human and abstract origin, such as a group of people. It can refer to an individual as well, but that kind of gets into the ad hominem or appeal to the person. So we're not going to look at that one as closely here. We're going to focus on looking at genetic fallacy from specifically the group or a group of people, because again, it does overlap a bit with appeal to the person if you're looking at the individual. These arguments reject a claim based solely on where it comes from instead of its merits. So, like, appeal to the person or ad hominem is gonna reject something based on attacking the person and saying that the person, is stupid, or the person is this, and therefore we can't trust what they say. This is then targeting groups. So, example, you can dismiss that alternative energy plan. It's the brainchild of a liberal think tank in Washington. So the group, right, is the liberal think tank. That's what they're saying. So they're saying you don't have to. That the energy plan that was provided is irrelevant or crap because and only because the liberal think tank created it, right? But those two things do not make a sound argument. Just because a liberal think tank created the energy plan does not mean that you can immediately dismiss it. Now, there might be valid reasons to dismiss it, but just them being the group being who it is not one of them, right? Russell's idea about tax hikes for the middle class come to him in a dream, so it must be bunk. So with this one, right, they have a little more connection to say, well, he got his tax hikes, the ideas about tax hikes for the middle class from a dream. Therefore, you shouldn't believe it. And now if you could talk about why a dream is not a valid reason to accept it, but it doesn't mean just because he got it from a dream doesn't mean that, again, the tax situation is immediately dismissed. I mean, and that's kind of all of these things. It's like fallacies try to get you to dismiss a lot of the time. Not always, but a lot of the fallacies try to get you to dismiss something simply because of its source. Rather than actually thinking through, like, just because the source, you may not agree with the person or the group or whatever the situation, doesn't mean that what they're presenting it determines validity or invalidity in sense of that. That has to be, there has to be a different reason for it. Same thing, we should reject that proposal for solving the current Social Security mess. It comes straight from the Republican Party. So again, technically Russell's idea, so it is the individual, but the group or end of thing is the dream, and then the last one, the Republican Party, right? So those are that idea of dismissing it simply from that. But the problem with this is that rejecting a claim solely from where it came from is not actually judging the argument on its merits or the claim on its merits. And the source is often irrelevant to the truth of that. Right? Good ideas can come from questionable sources. Bad ideas can come from great sources. Judging a claim based only on its source is problematic. It doesn't mean that it can be valid as part of assessing something. This genetic fallacy doesn't mean that you completely ignore sources, because if you look like, well, this claim came from this known website that just makes up stuff, or okay, how about the fake news, The Onion, right? This source came from the Onion website, which the Onion is all about satirical news. So clearly it's not real. There's where the source matters, right? But a lot of times when it's then a fallacy, it's just assuming that source is as valid and debunking something as the actual, like the Onion as a source. So it just means that when you hear someone say something like that, we can dismiss this, or this isn't valid, or this is that his idea is crap, or their idea is crap because it came from this group of people. That should immediately trigger something in your mind of like, oh, maybe I need to actually look more into it rather than immediately dismiss it. The next one is composition. And this is that argues that what is true of the parts must be true of the whole. It can also be what is true for one individual is thus true for all members. So what is true of the parts must be true of the whole. What is true for one individual is true for that same group, right? And the examples, I think, showcase this idea, right? The atoms that make up the human body are invisible. Therefore, the human body is invisible. This is an obvious one. If someone said this, you'd be like, yeah, right. Okay, good try. But that's the idea, right? That if the individual parts of something are true, then that I'm going to falsely attribute that to the whole, and that doesn't work. Likewise, if you do it to the individual, it has the same issue. Sorry there, I was about to sneeze and I didn't pause it soon enough. Okay, so this idea of what is true for one individual is true for all members. Each member of the club is productive and effective, so the club will be productive and effective, right? So this is the individual one, versus, and thus is true for the whole as well, or individual. Sorry, this is the parts, right? And this is the true for the individual, so it's for the whole. So it gives you this idea that, like, okay, well, if I'm going to assess, just because every member of the club is productive and effective doesn't mean the club will be productive and effective. Likewise, if you could turn that one around and say, well, the club is effective and productive, therefore all members of the club must be productive and effective. Well, that's this one right here. And that's not correct either. You can have a very effective club and have many members that are not effective and productive. Likewise, you could technically have, you're more likely, you could argue like you're more likely to have an effective club that's productive if all the members are effective and productive. But it's not a guarantee, which the composition fallacy is making that one-to-one. If this is true, then this is true. And you can't guarantee that. That is not always the case. Within that, right? This composition also does this a lot with where you actually probably will see it the most is like in money and statistical arguments. So for example, the average small investor puts $2,000 into the stock market every year. The average large investor puts $100,000 into stocks each year. Therefore, the group of large investors as a whole invest more money in the stock market than the small investors. So sorry, there's a typo in my example I wrote down there. So again, if a small investors put $2,000 into stock market each year, the average large investor puts $100,000. The group of large investors as a whole invests more money in the stock market than the small investors. But that doesn't tell you the numbers. There could be, thousands and thousands of more small investors that could actually mean that more investors are the small investors are putting in more money. It's very common to make those false connections again in any kind of statistical argument. So if you see anything with numbers, money, the composition one is the common one for that. All right, the next one is division fallacy. So division fallacy is the opposite of composition. It argues what is true of the whole must be true of the parts. So again, this is that it's again assuming that what is true of the group. I gave that example of the group, right? If the group is productive, then therefore the people must be productive. The machine is heavy, therefore all parts of the machine are heavy. University students study every conceivable subject, so that university student over there also studies every subject, right? You can't just because the whole, just because the club is, right, if we go back to this one here, right, this was the individual, right? Each individual club member was this, so they're all effective. But if we turn that around to make it division and say, well, the club is productive and effective, so every person in the club is productive and effective, then you have the division fallacy. They're very similar. They're easy to mix up. And ultimately with this, I do it all the time too, where I'm like, oh, that's composition, that's division. With both of these, it's just being aware of that the one is with parts and one's with the whole, but they're both doing the exact same thing. And so this is both done with, again, groups or things or individuals. But it's if you know composition, you're going to know the division one for that. And it's just being aware that we can't judge something by the individuals to assume the whole. We can't judge from the whole to assume the individuals. It just doesn't work. Appeal to the person. This is also known as ad hominem. This is specifically about criticizing a person rather than the claim itself. So the idea with this one is that you attack their character. We have the list here, and our personal attacks, attack on circumstance, attack on hypocrisy, or what's called poisoning the well, which is the idea that whatever they touch then is ruined, kind of thing. These can get very nasty. This is one where I was saying this one I think is less subtle. This one's super obvious usually. It appeals to people who enjoy, I guess, attacking people. It also appeals to people who have strong feelings about individuals. And or who they're for. You see this a lot in politics, in part because we're voting for an individual, so that the best way to get people to not support them is to criticize the person, right? Instead of focusing on the policies and the choices that they're making, we focus on them, like their flaws as a person. But of course, the problem with this is it's obviously not a valid type of argument. Because the type of person that is supposedly being claimed to be has no relevance on any other aspect of the argument. And often with ad hominem attacks, they're not even truthful in terms of the attack that's being laid on the person. So it can be both. It can be that you're saying, well, this person believes this, therefore like this is irrelevant. But a lot of times it's more of just a direct attack on someone. It doesn't matter if it's actually true or not. They're just using the attack to invalidate everything else that the person is saying, right? So Jones has argued for a ban on government-sanctioned prayer in schools and at school-sponsored events, but he is a rabid atheist without morals of any kind. Anything he has to say on this issue is bound to be a perversion of the truth. We should reject Chin's argument for life on other planets. He dabbles in the paranormal. Madison says she is opposed to abortion, but you can't take her seriously. Her view goes against everything her party stands for. So this one is the hypocrisy. Right? One, that she's being a hypocrite because her view is going against everything that the party is supposed to do. This one is a character and personal attack. Oops. Right. And this one is it's kind of personal attack / circumstances. Right. You can't believe him because they're saying like because he dabbles in the paranormal that is like a character flaw, but it's circumstances in the sense of the rejection of the paranormal. Essentially, this claim is trying to say that if anyone who believes in the paranormal is therefore immediately not a valid person to believe, it's not saying it in a nice way, or it's not even saying it in like a neutral way of like, oh well, because he believes in the paranormal, he's more likely to believe this, right? No, it's meant to be like a negative thing here, right? So, but I would argue that it's both attacking his character or person and also the circumstance, which is the dabbling in paranormal within that. Of course, the issue with this is that, it's not valid at all. You can't, claims have to be judged on their merits, not guilty by association, which is what is going on here. And these are often meant to not just attack the claim. I think that's important to recognize. When people use the appeal to the person or ad hominem, they are not often just trying to discredit whatever thing the person is talking about. They're usually trying to discredit the person themselves, right? So it's basically like trying to get both things at the same time. I'm going to target and attack the argument or claim, and while I'm doing that, I'm also going to try to discredit and attack the individual as well. And if you can discredit the individual in someone's mind, then the next time that they come up, and again, this is why this is done in politics a lot, then the next time they say something or do something, the person is going to be hesitant to believe it, because that's going to be fresh in their mind that not only was their argument incorrect, but their whole character is now up in question from that. And again, this comes in a lot of varieties of this, but ultimately there's no justification in rejecting a claim because of a person's faults, unless, again, you can show how a person's faults translate into faulty claims. If you can connect and say, like, this is they believe this information, or they're going based on this type of information, and the problem with that is that this information is incorrect, so of course their proposal is going to be incorrect, right? Then I can claim like that their misunderstanding of something is leading to the problem. But you can't just base on the idea of, well, just because Chen dabbles in the paranormal doesn't mean that he's wrong about a life on other planets just right straight away. Where is he basing that on? We don't know where is he deriving his information from? Now, if it's based on, if they say, like, Chen believes there's life on other planets because he believes an alien told him so, then you have more reason to reject the claim, right? But just his belief in paranormal alone doesn't mean that he's wrong about the other thing, or that we should immediately reject it, right? You can't just immediately dismiss a claim because a person's character is dubious. It can be something that you take into consideration. I think that's the key here, right? It's not saying, oh, well, ignore their character altogether. It's don't reject a claim or argument just solely on the basis of their character. Instead, and be wary that if someone is using the appeal to the person and attacking someone, you should be wary of their argument and claim as well, because likely they don't actually have a good defense. You do this when you want to, again, discredit someone personally, or you literally have no other way to discredit their claim. If they have a really good claim and an argument that's backed up, and you're like, crap, people are going to like this, and I need them not to vote for that person. Well, then if I target this person, then if I can get people not to like the person, they'll ignore whatever proposals he or she is putting forward. And that's the insidious nature of this one. Again, some of the fallacies I feel like are pretty insidious in terms of like how they treat people. But it's all, again, just go listen to political speeches. It's done all the time. I mentioned this before, like Donald Trump is the king of this. He attacks everyone. And he criticizes everyone and gives them nicknames. And it's all an attempt to discredit the person, so that you stop even seriously taking into consideration what they're saying or doing. And people fall for it all the time. And sometimes because it's catchy, sometimes because we just are looking for any excuse to reject another side or position. But again, it's done often because they don't always have anything better to argue against them. So you make it so that people just on an emotional level are connecting with that, and it can help that person. There's other things besides politicians, but I feel like if you watch any kind of political debate, it's going to come up. It's guaranteed to come up in that. And again, the appeal to person can come in several varieties. Besides the personal attack is just often insults, right? As I mentioned. And there's no other purpose for it with that. And then there's also specifically with the circumstances, the claim, the who they are, who they're connected to. So it's the person's circumstance of the situation they're in over their character. And again, the hypocrisy one you hear quite a bit, like, oh, we shouldn't believe them because they're a hypocrite. Their party does this, or they said this in the past and now they're doing this, so we can't trust them. But just because they've changed their viewpoint doesn't mean that you automatically can't trust someone, right? Where is the hypocrisy coming in? It's basically just, any fallacy is essentially just whittling down a larger argument into a snippet so that it's catchy, so it's easier to remember, and it's easy to get people to dismiss faster, essentially. Equivocation is next, and this is using a word in two different ways in an argument to come to a false conclusion. This are the examples of this. The end of everything is its perfection. The end of life is death. Therefore, death is the perfection of life. These ones are like really, this is what people sometimes call like circular arguments, right? You're just making a circular reasoning. It doesn't ever make sense. Only man is rational, no woman is man, therefore no woman is rational. People often play with these in terms of like thought exercises. I don't see these ones come up in like daily life as often. They can, it's just not as common as the other ones we've looked at so far. In part because they feel like circular reasoning. This one's harder to get behind. Unless you're like doing some crazy thought exercise with it, right? Laws can only be created by lawgivers. There are as many laws of nature, therefore there must be a lawgiver, namely God. I think these ones are easier for people to see through, because again, there's different levels of fallacies, and some are subtle and sneaky, and in part because they're used all the time. And then there's ones like this with equivocation where you're like, it's not hard to see where the error in logic takes place. You can see another one here. Someone might argue like a bat is a mammal, therefore baseball players use mammals to hit baseballs. That one's even more out of that, right, and playing on the term of the word bat. So here you have this idea of the end of everything is perfection. The end of life is death. Therefore, death is the perfection of life. They use the word end and end here differently. Same thing. Man is rational. No woman is man. Therefore, no woman is rational. It's using the play on man and the play on woman. This one, example here, is saying the animal that is a bat, and then changing the meaning of the bat or misunderstanding that. This one can sometimes happen when people hear bat and think baseball bat and didn't realize you were talking about an animal. But I mean, obviously, if they're saying a bat is a mammal, therefore baseball players use mammals to hit baseballs. That's just completely misunderstanding the word. But it does technically fall under equivocation too. But you see these ones way more than that example. It's a good, funny example, though, that I thought was worth at least throwing in there. Okay, the next is appeal to popularity, right? Also called appeal to the masses. This one is about basically arguing that a claim must be true because a lot of people believe it, right? If this is the everyone does it, is how everyone believes a claim, so the claim must be true. But I also call this one, well, everyone, it's the kids that go, Mom, everyone does it. Everyone has one. And it's that because everyone has this or does this, then it must be true, right? So everyone has a Stanley Cup. We looked at those. Therefore, Stanley Cups must be the best. But that's not necessarily true at all with that. Most people approve of the government's new security measure, even though innocent people's privacy is sometimes violated. So I believe that that's justified. So they're arguing that even though this new security measure violates people's privacy, because most people approve of it, it must be justified. All right. The vast majority of Americans believe that there's a supreme being. So how could you doubt it? Of course the war is justified. Everyone believes that it's justified. That's this one. This one's pretty straightforward and I think identifying. But I will say that this is one that can be convincing to people because, again, peer pressure. The appeal to popularity is enticing. And we as human beings don't want to be the odd man out a lot of the time. And so this one tends to, pull us in that direction sometimes, especially if it's not quite as blatant. I tried to pick examples that made it clear what it was. But if it's not quite as blatant, then you can kind of not recognize this right away. And I do think that people are more likely to fall for this because of the natural direction towards popularity. But you think about, like, obviously, just because something is popular or a lot of people believe it doesn't make it immediately true. They have a whole host of history of events that shows that that's not the case. People used to believe that women were witches, and that witches existed, and therefore, we needed to burn them at the stake or hang them. People used to believe that if people were sick, putting leeches on them, or which, again, you could argue some small benefit, but like they used to do excessive bleeding. They put leeches on people and then cut their wrist. They even had the doctors had this little machine that you put on the wrist and pushed up. That was my sound effect for that, pushing up there, and it cut them, which basically was like slitting your wrist essentially. And they put bowls over there and drain you of a lot of your blood. Well, of course, this, more often than not, all it did was weaken you from excessive blood loss, right? But a lot of people believed that if you had certain diseases or sicknesses, bleeding was the way to go. Obviously, that was not correct, even though a lot of people believe that. And I think this one's easy to get into of, well, I don't know, and I'm not sure about that subject. So instead of researching it or going in and like discovering it myself, I'm just going to go with what everyone else. And it does make sense in that way, right? Well, if everyone's saying this is true and I don't know, I don't have anything in my background information or knowledge or observation to say otherwise, I don't really want to be the person speaking up and saying, well, how do we know that? So and it's easy to convince yourself that if everyone else is believing this event or thing, then they're probably right. Sometimes that's true. I think you can take it like the idea of, like, if all your friends are telling you this is an issue, it doesn't automatically mean they're right, but it means you should stop and look into it. Likewise, I think in these cases, if everyone is saying this is a good idea, it is not enough for a valid argument to be a sound argument to justify immediately believing then that something's justified or true. But it doesn't mean you ignore it either. It means you probably need to look into it more. But I think when people are afraid to admit that they don't know, that they need more information, or they have a fear of being the odd person out, which there are plenty of people that don't want to stand out, they don't want to be outliers, this specific fallacy is going to work really well on them because they're going to go with the flow and just accept what the majority of people are saying, right? But the reality is large groups of people are no more infallible than an individual. And again, while it should maybe have you stop and think, because it can be an indication that there is truth to it, unless it's a group of experts, right? Then it's just a group of people by itself doesn't help. But even then, experts sometimes can be wrong too. So, all of that has to just usually mean you just can't take it on face value, although you're more likely to have a reasonable belief in the claim being true if a large group of I don't know, scientists all agree that this event is taking place because of whatever theory, well, then I have a more valid reason to say that's probably true, because I'm going to trust the expertise of the people. But if it's just, hey, people, just random anonymous people believe this, where that doesn't give it any more credence or validity just because of that, right? So that's kind of the difference with it. So the next is appeal to tradition. And this one claims, argues that a claim must be true just because it's part of tradition, right? And this has similarities to appeal to the popularity or the masses, right? If this is what has been practiced for hundreds of years, maybe it's true, right? And I think the same thing, if a bunch of people are telling you everyone this whole group of people believes this to be true and you're the only one that doesn't, then you probably want to find out more information. Likewise, if this is a tradition that's been done and stuff for a long time, you don't want to just dismiss it outright, but you also can't just accept it just because it's tradition. So the examples, right? The medicine has been used by people since ancient history, therefore it must be an effective way to treat disease. I gave you the example of bloodletting, right? The bleeding. It was used for quite a long time. It is not an effective way to treat people. Of course, publishing pornography is wrong. In this community, there's a tradition condemning it that goes back 50 years. You may still come to the conclusion that publishing pornography is wrong, but you can't say that it's solely based on the fact that the community has a tradition of banning it to be the justified reason for that, right? So that's the important thing, is sometimes like when someone's using appeal to tradition or any of these fallacies, you can end up agreeing with their conclusion. But the problem is their premise is irrelevant. Their premise is wrong, making it an invalid argument. So then it's like, okay, well, if I believe the conclusion, I think it's right, I need to have a better premise that's actually a good, strong premise that actually supports and leads to the conclusion. Because these irrelevant premise fallacies are all just using premises that are irrelevant to the final decision or belief. Right, another one that's here. Astrology has been around for thousands of years, so there must be something to it. That it just is not, right? You have to have more backed evidence than just tradition. Just like you have to have more backed and support than just popularity or a large number of people. Appeal to ignorance. This, of course, argues that a lack of evidence proves something. Basically, well, if no one else can prove me wrong, then it must be right. If you don't know, there's the ignorance part, right? It can also be that a claim must be false because it hasn't been proved. Let's cut this off. I didn't realize that cut off the thing to be true, right? So no one has shown that ghosts aren't real, so they must be real. I'll try to write that back in there. Right. That this is a problem with this, right? Is that is the idea that somehow if you can't prove it, if you can't prove that they aren't real, like, so what it does is it puts the onus on the person that is listening to the argument, right? If I say, well, no one has shown me that ghosts aren't real. Right? Can you prove to me that ghosts aren't real? And if I say that to you and you can't prove right away that ghosts aren't real, well, then they must be real. It's a false connection between the two things, right? Another variation of the claim is that it must be false because it hasn't been proven to be true. So it can either go where, like, I haven't proved it wrong or I haven't proved it right kind of thing, right? There are, let me look at the examples, then we'll talk about some that look like it. It's clear that God exists because science hasn't proved that he doesn't exist. So there's the alternate version of that, right? Which I wrote sideways here. Because, so the first one says to me, no one has disproved that ghosts, right, exist, so they must exist. It's clear that God exists because science hasn't proven that he doesn't exist, right? You can't disprove my theory that JFK was killed by LBJ, therefore my theory must be correct, right? Again, you can do it the other way where, like, no one has proved that this is correct, therefore it must be wrong. It follows the same logic of just the lack of proof is not evidence that something is correct or not. That's how that one should go with that. Okay, there are other cases, though, where the claims may look like appeal to ignorance, but they're not. If there is something that we carefully search for and thoroughly enough, and if there is something to find, it will be uncovered, then the failure to find that thing can be the argument. So to give an example of what that means, if a botanist scans the forest looking for a rare plant but does not find one, even after searching all possible places, and then they can't find any evidence, then not finding the plant can be good evidence that the plant does not exist in that location. And the reason for this is the conclusion is not based solely on lack of evidence, but the knowledge in these circumstances that any thorough search would probably reveal the plant. Right? It's not just, well, if no one can show me this plant, it must not exist. That doesn't work. But if I say, I know as a botanist that there should, this type of plant, if it exists, should be in this environment right here. And we, after a thorough, exhaustive of search, we have not found it in this area, then it is logical to assume the plant does not exist in this area, right? Even though there was no, because you found no evidence of that plant. But like if a plant was existing in this area, we would have found it, essentially. There's no way that's, and I think it can be a little convoluted, but that's the idea with it. There are circumstances where on face value, it sounds the same, right? Oh, well, there was a lack of finding plants. Like there's no evidence of the plant. But in those circumstances, like I said, make sense that the search would have revealed the plant if it existed in that location. Versus just, no one's proved ghosts aren't real, so therefore they are. Right, as I mentioned, the appeals to ignorance involve the notion of burden of proof. The weight of evidence on the argument is essentially like put on the other person. I get to try to off-put, instead of me who's making the argument having the burden of proof, I put it off on the person listening and saying, you have to prove me wrong, right? And if you can't prove me wrong, and this is sometimes done in like rapid succession and stuff like that. Like basically, if you can't prove me wrong right now, then therefore I'm correct. But that's just that, ignorance in that area, it doesn't work. And this can have consequence if people take the bait, which they will try to do sometimes. And people use this in their argument as well. So if I say gremlins are real, and now you need to prove that I'm wrong. And if you can't prove that gremlins don't exist, then clearly I'm right and gremlins exist, right? I'm trying to put the burden of proof on the other person instead of me finding proof whether gremlins exist or not. And if someone then says, okay, fine, let me explain, I'm going to try to prove that gremlins are not real, then they end up accepting the burden of proof. And then it's perfect for the person who made the argument, because then they could be like, oh yeah, I see you can't prove it. Like all the work, basically people use appeal to ignorance to try to transfer all the work onto someone else, right? I'm not going to research and figure out if this is true or not. No, I'm just going to make the other person prove this or disprove this, right? And if you can't, and again, a lot of times what they'll do is like, if you can't do it right now, then clearly it's wrong. And you don't want to, if you're wanting to debate or argue a person with this, you do not want to take on the burden of proof. But this is the easiest one to fall into that trap where you then step in and try to be like, but here, let me show you why I think gremlins aren't there. And then all of a sudden you now are on the defensive rather than the person that was trying to throw this out. Right? If you doubt the claim, you're under no obligation to prove it wrong, essentially with that. All right, the next one is appeal to emotion. And this is the use of emotions as the premise in arguments, right? It's trying to persuade someone that about a conclusion based solely on his or her feelings, rather than providing actually relevant facts and information. It can appeal to a person's guilt, anger, pity, fear, compassion, resentment, and pride. And then the types of appeal of emotion: appeal to pity, appeal polishing, and scare tactics. And we'll talk about I'll talk about those now, and then we'll get into this. But the key with this is this one's also used a lot, right? People with strong emotions often don't. We've looked at this before, right? If you get too emotionally invested, you stop thinking critically. So if I can rile you up and appeal to some base emotion, then you stop thinking critically and just go with that emotion. It's a very conniving way of getting people to fall in line with your arguments. So appeal to pity, this is, as it's stated, that one's pretty straightforward. It's an attempt to persuade people to accept a conclusion by evoking pity, compassion, or empathy, right? So, let me get this one here. What is this? Compassion or empathy as well. right? It's a ploy. It's to play on those emotions. An example, I should get this merit scholarship. I am homeless and penniless, so the money would get put to good use, right? Well, it is sad that the person is homeless and penniless, but that is not a justifiable reason for why they should get the scholarship. Unless the entire scholarship was the qualifications were homeless and penniless, then I suppose that would be a valid argument. But most scholarships, that's not the conditions of getting it, right? They're trying to appeal to the emotion, to appeal to people feeling sad for that person, feeling empathy for that person, and say, well, we should give it to them because they need it the most, or they're the most deserving, right? Appeal polishing. This is an attempt to persuade people by flattering them. Flattery. So an example with this, I know you'll vote for me in the upcoming election because you have the true American spirit and genuine wisdom that comes from faith and hard work. You're an awesome person, right? I know awesome people vote for me and you're an awesome person. That it's just flattery, right? Polishing, right? Make it shiny and look nice. And then scare tactics. I mean, this one's in the name. It's meant to scare people. This is the fear-based emotion, right? With that. And specifically unwarranted fear. So unless we defeat Prop 13, it will be taught in our schools and more kids will want to become gay, right? Like that one's used a lot in terms of, I think also with specifically LGBTQ things in general. Oh, don't do this, or like this will encourage them to become this way, or we can't teach sex ed because then kids will have sex. It does it with that too. So anything where like, if we teach them this information, they'll become this, and you should be afraid of this. And it's like, that's not how that works at all. But again, these are all based on emotion. How can we scare someone so they will stop thinking? And that's really what the appeal to emotion is, to get them to stop critically thinking. Because if someone has strong emotions and those fears and that uncertainty, then they're likely to stop thinking at some point with that. So red herring is the next one. This is intentionally raising irrelevant issues during an argument. There are lots of times in arguments where people will unintentionally provide irrelevant information. Red herring is when someone does it on purpose to distract, right? This is all about distraction from the main issue, right? So the picture here, what is your plan to address climate change? And they give an answer that has nothing to do with it. My tax cut boosted the economy. You're like, wait, that has nothing to do with taxes, but I'm just going to answer something else, or I'm going to go in a different direction with it. Oh, that's a really good thing about climate change, or sorry, not taxes here, right? They're asking about climate change. That's a really good thing about climate change, but let me tell you about my tax cuts and economy first. And then this you see a ton of political debates as well. When a politician doesn't want to answer a question because they know that they either don't have an answer or it won't be popular, they divert and use the red herring for this. Sometimes this one's super obvious, right? Like climate change and tax cut are not anywhere close to it. You can have more subtle red herrings where you're throwing out irrelevant information actually related to the argument. Because in this example with the cartoon there, obviously the tax cut doesn't have anything to do with climate change. But so let's look at some examples with this. And again, the ones you really have to, this is pretty obvious. The ones you have to pay attention to are the ones that may seem like it supports it, but are actually just distractions because they aren't relevant, right? Those are the tricky ones, not these obvious deflections that go in, like even people who like support the person that's speaking often recognize when they do this crazy pivot, right? Because it's so obvious. But the subtle red herrings, when someone's really good at this, using this type of fallacy, you may not notice it right away because they make it look like this irrelevant issue or information that they're providing is actually relevant. But it's really just meant to distract so they can move away from that, or make you think that they understand and have support for their argument. So example, every woman should have the right to an abortion on demand. There's no question about it. These anti-abortionist activists block the entrances to abortion clinics, threaten abortion doctors, and intimidate anyone who wants to terminate a pregnancy. So if you just hear that, it on the surface, it kind of looks like, I mean, they're still talking about the same topic, right? They didn't go off on something else. It sounds like, it's all connected to abortion. It sounds like but they're shifting the subject to the behavior of anti-abortion activists, right? So the thing is, every woman should have the right to an abortion on demand. And then right here, they go, keeps erasing. There's no question about it. These anti-abortionist activists, oops, I should probably include activist in that. Right? All of a sudden now, all of this is all about anti-abortion activists and not about whether women should have the access to abortion. It's just telling the negative things that anti-abortion activists are doing. So then the idea is, oh, look at all these horrible things that anti-abortionist activists are doing. And instead of thinking about like, well, wait, why should women have access to abortion on demand, right? And what anti-abortionist people are doing has nothing to do with that. You can still agree like, oh yeah, that's crappy of them, but it doesn't actually support the argument. But hopefully you see how that one's kind of subtle, right? Because it still is on topic. Here's the other one. The legislators should vote for the 3 strikes and you're out crime control measure. I'm telling you, crime is a terrible thing when it happens to you. It causes death, pain, and fear, and I wouldn't want to wish these things on anyone. So the legislature should vote for the 3 strikes and you're out crime control measure. That's the first part. Then it talks about how terrible crime is and how they wouldn't wish it on anyone, right? But that's changing the subject, right? It gets changed to like the terrible cost of crime and stuff, and hasn't have anything to do with the voting for the 3 strikes and you're out crime measure, right? You can agree that crime has horrible consequences, but it has little to do with the merits and demerits of the 3 strikes bill or measure, right? They're not directly connected, or at least they haven't made the connection here, right? So that's that. And again, it's subtle. It feels like they're answering the topic, but they're not. All right, the next one is straw man. This is the fallacy of distorting, weakening, or oversimplifying of someone's position so that it can be more easily attacked or refuted. Right, and so this is like the like layout of it. Reinterpret claim X so that it becomes weak and absurd, and then attack claim Y, and then conclude that X is unfounded. So this is meant to confuse. The straw man is not only meant to distort and weaken by attacking or oversimplifying. It's also meant to kind of go like off topic in there as well. So here's Senator Miller is opposed to the military spending bill, saying that it's too costly. Why does he always want to slash everything to the bone? He wants a pint-sized military that couldn't fight off a crazed band of terrorists, let alone a rogue nation. So right, they're saying Senator Miller is against military spending on the grounds that it costs too much. That's right. So this is the first part. They're saying, okay, this is why he's against it, because they're saying it costs too much. But then his position of that I don't want additional military spending because it's too expensive gets twisted into the claim that the military should basically, if you agree with this, the military will be declined so much so that that there'll be a pint-sized military that could not fight off a crazed band of terrorists, let alone a rogue nation. And this is meant to connect to fear as well, right? It's that somehow there's nothing in there that says his initial position is absurd, but by twisting the initial thing of he's opposed to the military spending bill because he says it's too costly, they twist that into making it something absurd, right? Now I'm going to go off about how this is going to lead to this destruction or the decline, and that you won't be able to fight off anyone, right? Miller wants a less expensive military, not an ineffective one, at least based on how this is being stated, right? And a less expensive military doesn't mean cutting it down to a pint-sized military. Nowhere is that stated. But and that's why the more you think about this, it sounds absurd. But this one is also very effective because people get emotionally connected to these. Another one, lawyers for the ACLU have sued to remove the massive Ten Commandments monument from the lobby of the courthouse. As usual, they are anti-religious. They want to remove every vestige of religion and faith from American life. Don't let them do it. Don't let them win yet another battle in their war to secularize the whole country. So again, this is a common one that comes up with arguments in church and state. So it's saying the ACL wants the Ten Commandments monument removed from the lobby of a government building, which in of itself is not religious or anti-religious, right? You could have people who were Christians say that there's supposed to be separation of church and state and we shouldn't have a big Ten Commandments monument in a government building, right? And so there is nothing that proves or disproves religious beliefs based on wanting the Ten Commandments monument to be removed, right? It's not in itself anti-religious. And wanting to keep church and state separate is not the same thing as removing every vestige of religion and faith from American life. Again, it's that over absurd, fear-based, oh no, look, they're trying to actively destroy religious belief. They're attacking all Christian faith, right? By characterizing the ACLU as anti-religious in a way that creates strong opposition to it, then people are going to be more behind that support of it. You can reverse this and say that the opposite side, those who favor religious displays on government property, are fanatics who want a theocracy. And it's the same problem. Just because someone who is religious or someone who wants the Ten Commandments there and is religious doesn't mean that they're religious fanatics and want a theocracy. Right? It's again, straw man is all about making an argument absurd, twisting and characterizing things in a way that gets you emotionally invested. So when you're listening to people and they're doing this, it's definitely pay attention to like, if all of a sudden I'm getting super emotionally like charged by something they're saying, or it starts sounding really like crazy, like to go from opposed to military spending to he's going to create something that they're not even going to be able to fight tiny little terrorists. Wait a minute. What? How are those connected other than you're trying to emotionally bait me with this absurd connection? All right. And then the last one that we have for today is that two wrongs make a right. This is the idea that it's basically in the name that someone else's wrong act can somehow make yours right. Right? It's saying that you doing something morally wrong is justified because someone else did it. Well, they were stealing, so therefore it's okay for me to steal as well. Right? I have a clear conscience. I stole his laptop because he took mine a month ago. That's not a justified reason for stealing. There probably isn't ever one for stealing a laptop, but it's certainly not, well, they took mine, so I get to do it. It's the two wrongs don't make a right kind of thing. My wife had an affair, so I'm within my right to have one too. Right? Again, that just because someone else did something wrong is not a justification for morally impermissible behavior, right? If your action lacks justification, it cannot acquire justification by what someone else does. You cannot justify your actions because someone else did something wrong too, right? Okay, I snatched a few of those brat candies at the supermarket. So what? 3 other people did too, right? And this one is very common that people try to use to justify their actions, right? Well, it's a known secret. It's an open secret that everyone does this here at this company. So don't worry about it. You're fine, right? No, just because people are doing it doesn't mean that means that your actions for that and doing it are okay as well. Some of this has that feel of popularity pull to it. The idea that like, whoa, everyone else is doing this, so I should do it too. But this one's very much about the moral justification of an argument. That, this idea that if you're doing something morally wrong, you can justify it because some other people have done it. Well, everyone was rioting after this celebration of the game, and so, it was fine that I threw a rock through a window. It's that same type of thing. It's almost mob mentality sometimes, although it doesn't always have to be a mob with two wrongs make a right. It can be just that this person did it, so therefore I can do it. But you do hear it a lot too in like mob mentality. Well, the whole crowd was doing it, so I thought it was okay to do, or I decided it was acceptable. It's also sometimes trying to be like that, well, I wasn't the only one kind of thing. So I think you hear this one a lot when people try to justify their actions and their behavior when they know they did something wrong. They're like, I know that what I did is wrong, but I'm going to try to justify it. And the only way I can actually try to justify it is to claim other people are doing it. So therefore, it must not be that bad. All right, so that is for the first part of fallacies and arguments. Again, the next lecture, we're going to look at additional fallacies, as well, specifically the unacceptable premises, as well as some rhetoric and different things within rhetoric. So that we'll be continuing there. Again, there were lots of fallacies. We will be continuing the fallacies in the next lecture.